All right. Hello, hello, hello. This is Helen Thomas and the CDFM study group. Welcome and welcome back to some of you as we begin review of CDFM Module 2, aka the Beast, right? So I always recommend to those that are studying for the CDFM exams that you study in this order: Module 1, Module 3, then Module 2 last. However, as I mentioned to some of you earlier, is when you study for Module 1, you need to go through Module 2 and Module 3, the table of contents, and you're looking for similar topics of what's covered in Module 1. Likewise, when you get to Module 3, look in Module 1 and 2 for the same topics that you're dealing with in Module 3. Because what you will find once you get through all three modules is that a lot of the information overlaps. And you may find more information in one module, even though you're focused on this particular module. So I definitely recommend that. All right, so we're going to go ahead and begin Module 2. I say the Beast because this one has, go ahead and mute, yes please. This one has a lot more information, key players, key documents that had you gone through 1 and 3, you would have covered the majority of them. And then Module 2 will add some additional processes into it. So let us begin with the 2020 study guide on page 2.1.9. So remember, you're taking the Certified Defense Financial Manager exam. You're being certified. So everything that you do is based off of what's going on at the DoD level. Most of us work in subordinate organizations, so it's a little bit difficult to picture or learn what's going on there. But your key to success is understanding 95, I might say even 99% of what's in the book, because my disclaimer is the books, the study guides do not include everything you may see on the exam. Because if you notice, they will reference laws, regulations, policies. The expectation is that you would have read all of that. Who's got the time? Maybe you do. I haven't found anybody. So that means you have to understand what's in the book, at least 95% of what's in the book, so that you have a working knowledge. Not just memorize what's on the page, because you're not going to see it in the same format. You need to be able to understand what is going on. Like I say, tell the story. Who's done it? Why are they doing it? When are they doing it? When it moves from one location to the next, who does it go to? And so forth. So those are the kind of questions that you have to keep in mind as you're going through. What law initiated that function, that process? So for instance, on page 217, it talks about the mission of the Department of Defense. I'm not going to read that for you because it's right there. But as you go through the structure of the Department of Defense and we get to the key players, you're going to need to know their functions. Why are they in the Department of Defense? What do they provide? Because everything then trickles down to the money, the resources. Why do we give priority to those combatant commanders? Because you will learn, because operationally, that is what our function is for the Department of Defense, to support and defend the Constitution. So the resources are then funneled because of that. All right. Not much there. Let's go to page 9, 219, history. The National Security Act of 1947 is important to remember because there's a lot of key players or key functions that came out of it. I don't recommend for people to learn every law, every regulation in the study guide, but there's certain one, because of their importance and the amount of information that comes out of that law, then it's important for you to understand. So for those who just coming on, remember the session is being recorded, and this is the video that will get uploaded to YouTube. So depending on what you say, make sure you're muted if you're not speaking, because we don't want to capture anything that you may not want get on YouTube, right? All right, so the National Security Act of 1947, there's a couple of things came out of that. If you read that paragraph, you will see it established the National Security Council. We're going to talk about that council, who makes it up, why is it important? So that's important. The NSC, the National Security Council, came out of it. The CIA came out of it, Central Intelligence Agency. That's important. A civilian Secretary of Defense. That's the third thing that came out of that law. And the Office of the Secretary of Defense. That's the staff that works for that civilian sector. And Joint Chiefs of Staff. We don't have a representative from the Army, the Navy separate. Now we have a group that was formed in 1947. So remember, your president is a civilian, your Secretary of Defense is a civilian, so you're going to need military advisors to be able to do the job of defending our Constitution or the country. So National Security Act 1947 created the NSC, CIA, Office of the Secretary of Defense, Civilian Secretary of Defense, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff. All of those are going to come up in a few pages, and we're going to go through who makes up those groups or who that individual is as far as function, and then what do they provide as it goes down into the budget process. So we know, most people know we have an Army, a Navy, Marine, Air Force, but on or about December 2019, they established the Space Force. And what I want you, once we get to the diagram on the next page, I'm going to show you where they fall in the process, because that becomes important as policies flow through the hierarchy. Where are things going? There's some other stuff on this page I wanted to point out. So December 2019, that was the new structure. The Space Force was established. So the Secretary of Defense, what's the function of the Secretary of Defense? It is the principal advisor on defense to the president and the National Security Council. We're going to talk about the council in a little bit. So that's your function of the SecDef. Under the direction of the president, and the president is the commander-in-chief. So I'm reading at the bottom of page 219, that second to last paragraph. The Secretary of Defense exercises authority, direction, and control over the entire Department of Defense. Makes sense. All right. So the diagram on page 10, what I want to point out here, because the success under CDFM is you being given a list of groups and personnel and staff, and can you put them in the order or where they belong if you have a matching situation? Do you know who works for Congress versus who works for the president? Who works under the Secretary of Defense? So on the diagram on page 10, you see at the very top in the middle, you have the Secretary of Defense. To the right of that, off by itself, you have the DODIG, Inspector General. They are off to themselves, independent. Then under the Secretary of Defense, you have the Office of the SecDef. To the left, that's its staff. Then to the right of that, you have the Army. And under the Army, that's the armed forces. So the Army is represented. They have a Department of the Army, Department of the Navy. But look, under the Department of the Navy, you have the Navy, and you also have the Marine Corps. I think it's a commandant, if I'm not mistaken. So the Marine Corps falls under the Navy. To the right of that, you have the Air Force. The Air Force falls under that group, and also that newly established group, the Space Force, falls under the Air Force. So you need to know where these structures lie. If you get a matching and they give you the Space Force, and you need to know where does it go, it goes under the Air Force. So the three primary military department is Army, Navy, Air Force. Then off to the far right, you have the Joint Chiefs of Staff. We're going to talk about actually most of these and what their functions are. Because your joint staff are those individuals in the uniform that helps the Secretary of Defense, who's a civilian, to know what type of military resources are needed to meet the standards, to meet the requirements and the objectives of that president and the National Security Council. Then you see a dotted line going down to the combatant commanders. The solid line tells you that operationally, the chain of command runs from the Secretary of Defense down to those combatant commanders. That's the solid line. However, again, Secretary of Defense is a civilian. He may be retired, but he may not be able to translate the orders of the president. So you have the joint staff from the Army, Navy, Air Force, all of them represented on the right to advise the SecDef and translate the orders of the SecDef to those 11 combatant commanders. So do I have any questions on the structure? That's on page 10. Let me pause and breathe for a minute. All right, I don't hear any questions. So on page 2111 out of the 2020 study guide, now we're going to look at the different structures, what makes them up, what makes up the Office of the Secretary of Defense, his staff. So if you look on page 11, on the bullets, you see Under Secretary of Defense for Research, Under Secretary of Defense. So these are all the secretariats. They have specific functions. If you see the title, Department of the Army, Assistant Secretary of the Army for that lets you know it's at the Army level versus Under Secretary of Defense. You will know that title is at the OSD level, the DOD level. I'm saying that because sometimes they might say, okay, who's responsible for acquisition at the DOD level? You cannot pick Assistant Secretary of the Army for acquisition because that says I'm at the Army level. You got to know where things lie in the hierarchy. So if you notice, the majority of the secretariats at the DOD level starts off Under Secretary of Defense. So we're going to go over the USD for Research and Engineering, Under Secretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment. That's our acquisition folks. Under Secretary of Defense for Policy. If you remember the PPBE, Plan, Program, Budget, Execution, the planning part is covered by the policy guy. Under Secretary of Defense for Personnel and Readiness, guess what they deal with? Manpower. The Under Secretary of Defense Comptroller, the CFO, Chief Financial Officer, they deal with the budget, execution of that budget in the PPBE process. The Under Secretary of Defense for Intelligence, so your CIA folks, your intelligence folks, they advise the SecDef. Director of Cost Assessment and Program Evaluation, DCAPE. That DCAPE is also going to come up several times throughout Module 1, 2, and 3. And I'll show you what they do. These are your cost analysis folks, right? If you got anything dealing with money, in a sense, or cost evaluation, cost analysis, that DCAPE name is going to come up. Director of Operational Test and Evaluation, when we talk about acquisition, the OIP is going to come up, the OT&E. General Counsel, Inspector General, so you got your legal folks. So it makes sense apply it to something that maybe you see or work with on a day-to-day basis. Because once we get to the PPBE process, I'm going to explain what exactly is done. So the first law we talked about was what? What is actually the only law we talk about so far? Anybody want to take a, go ahead?
Is it the National Security Act of 1947?
Yes, ma'am. And then whenever you learn the law, put the year on there too, just in case. Again, I don't see the ASMC exams. I don't work for ASMC. I'm just like you. I just happen I've already completed my requirements and I like teaching it. I like explaining it to others. So in order to remember National Security Act of 1947, you're going to learn a new one at the top of page 13. So we talk about the Joint Chiefs of Staff from each services, military advisors. The law that established a chairman in charge of those Joint Chiefs at the top of page 13 is the 1986 Goldwater-Nichols Act. If you look, it says identify the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff as the senior military advisor to the Secretary of Defense, to the President, and to the National Security Council. This is an important individual that you will see multiple times in this study guide. So again, let's think of the structure. Secretary of Defense has the military department, Army, Navy, Air Force. Secretary of Defense also has a group of military advisors. That's their job, is to come up with, if they have a priority or an order for military requirements, then the Joint Staff is responsible for providing guidance to the Secretary of Defense. Because what we get from the Secretary of Defense is policies. The chairman does not give the military policy guidance. The Secretary of Defense does. However, the chairman and the rest of the Joint Chief of Staff advises, they're the subject matter experts on the military. So they advise the SecDef, then the Secretary of Defense gives us the policies to execute. So let's see what else. So it tells you Secretary of Defense advises the SecDef on other non-financial related matters. The chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff has a vice chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff. I'm pointing this guy or gal out because the vice chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, you will see throughout Module 2, has several roles. And let me see how far before, if I wrote this book, I would have put this other information up front, but it's not until like page 28. So the vice chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, okay, he's next in line as the chairman, makes sense. But what you'll see is the vice chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff also serves as the chairman of the Joint Requirements Oversight Council. Just bear with me right now until we get to page 28. Then I got to backtrack to make sure you understand this. So there's a few roles. The vice chairman is second in command to the chairman. The vice chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff serves as the chairman of the Joint Requirements Oversight Council, which you see on page 13. Not stated here, but you will see it later. The vice chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff is also a co-chairman under Defense Acquisition Board. They meet, they co-chair the Defense Acquisition Board with the acquisition person that we talked about in a few pages ago, the previous page. Are y'all still with me? So this is why I recommend Module 2 to be the last one that you attack, because there's a lot of all of this going back and forth. But I promise I will make this vice chairman of the Joint Staff clearer. All right, so you got the joint staff. I'm not going to go over that. On page 14, then you have combatant commanders. There was what? 11 of them. So the combatant commanders are in various regions of the world. So on page 15, you have a list of them. So if you look at that diagram, you see President, Secretary of Defense, and the Secretary of Defense has control of all of those 11 combatant commanders. You take the globe, and they all separated: Northcom, Southcom, Pacificom, Europe, all of that. 11. Because the mission of the Department of Defense is to provide defense to our Constitution, to our allies, and so forth, then the resources, I repeat again, trickles down to those combatant commanders. I'm repeating it because it's going to make sense in a little bit. So I want you to pay attention to page 2.1.15, that bottom left slide. And I know it's written again, but I like to use the slides because it's easier to picture. It says the operational chain of command runs from the president to the SecDef to those combatant commanders. President is a civilian. Secretary of Defense is a civilian. Your combatant commanders are all military. So who advises the Secretary of Defense on military operations? That's a check on learning. Anybody can answer.
You said who advises the SecDef?
Right. So your president is a civilian, your SecDef is a civilian, but operational chain of command says control from the SecDef goes to those military commanders.
The Joint Chiefs of Staff?
So your joint staff, but primarily your chairman. So the chairman is like the commander. And then the Army, Navy, Air Force, all their representatives, they're all joint staff. They fall under the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff. So that also implies that before the Goldwater-Nichols Act of 1986, that there wasn't a lead. It's each services has their own joint staff. There wasn't speaking as one military, or one military force. Until 1986, a chairman was designated, and the chairman provides the SecDef and the president with advice on military operation. Any question on that? So I kind of broke this down in part 1, part 2. If we don't get through all of this today, it's fine, because I schedule next week to continue. There's a lot of moving pieces. Any question? Right, I don't hear any questions. Let us proceed. All right, so page 16, we have the establishment of the National Security Council. All right, so what law established the National Security Council? Come on, you only learned 2 so far.
Is it the National Security Act of 1947?
There you go. All right. And when you're studying, that is what you have to do to remember things. It's not that I am so great with this information. It's because I've repeated it so many times in different angles. As I move along, you need to question yourself again. Okay, we talked about this National Security Council before. What did we learn? It was established based on from the National Security Act of 1947. That's all we've talked about so far. Because as you move on and you see information that we talked about previous pages, you have to pause and recall your knowledge of the previous page. That is how you become successful on the exam. If you take them in individual chunks and just keep rolling, it's going to be hard to determine how they relate to one another, how the information relates. So let's think about the National Security Council. That's the highest level you could think of, the highest forum. You have the president, who is the president of the National Security Council. On page 2117 at the top, it tells you those first 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 individuals are the primary principal members of the National Security Council. Since all of us are related somehow to the military, I will try to use military structure to help you to understand. So all of us have a higher command. So for the country, for the Department of Defense, the NSC is that higher command. It's made up of the president, the vice president, the secretary of defense, secretary of state, secretary of energy, and the secretary of treasury. Because again, we need the money guy. And we need to know how to pay for stuff. Then you have the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff as an advisor and a director of national intelligence. We need our intel guy to advise the group. And so higher command is the National Security Council. Once this council sits down, let's move to page 18. What the council does is they look at the posture of the country, what's going on inside the United States, what's going on with our allies overseas, what kind of threats do we face, which combatant command area do we see a potential threat. Then they come up with strategies, goals, objectives. All of that information is published on page 18 in a national security strategy. Think of that as a big operation order. Everybody familiar with an op order, right? So at least everybody on the group, so I don't have to like go through too much detail. Basically, your higher command will give you a document. It says, these are our priorities. These are what our goals for the next few years or whatever timeline. And in that operation order, it's going to say Department of Defense or defense related task are XYZ. So then Department of Defense will take the national security strategy document and pull out all the defense related things that the Department of Defense is responsible for doing. So National Security Council produces the national security strategy. Any question up to this point? Then you need to know the standing members and advisors on the National Security Council. So we went over that. On the bottom of page 18, now the Department of Defense takes that big op order, the national security strategy, and it then has to produce its own policies, defense related. And so on page 18, at the bottom, it talks about the national defense strategy. Because you got to take what your higher gives you, come up with your strategy to meet the higher's priorities. So the end result of what we're going to talk about is the national defense strategy. And it tells you the national defense strategy is produced every 4 years. The 4-year review is due in January of the second year of a new presidential term. So kind of time it out, applied since we're getting ready to do a presidential election in November. So that means next year, a new national defense strategy is going to be initiated, the January of the second year, so the second year of that presidential term. So not 25, but 26. They should be coming up with a new NDS. Any question? I got to take this slow because it's a lot. All right, on page 19, it says the intent of the National Defense Strategy, the NDS, is to align the department's capabilities. Because just because the National Security Council says defense, we want defense to do A through Z, defense may not have the capability to do all of it. It may be able to do some of it, but there must be some type of analysis completed to determine our capabilities. And so, because you have that chairman, the military guy, the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff will take that national security document, and they would then produce the national military strategy on page 19. Because we want to know, based on what the priorities are or what the mission is, what can the military do? What does the military need to do? Because we're not talking resources yet. So the national military strategy. So if you are asked who develops the national military strategy, the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff is the one that develops the national military strategy. If the question adds the words, who do we receive policy from on the national military strategy, policy comes from the Secretary of Defense. So it's play on words. So when you're taking these exams, you need to read every word. I always recommend take your index finger or one of your fingers and point on each word, because we're trained to scan. And sometimes we scan words and we ignore important keywords that are necessary. So the policy, if the word policy is incorporated, it comes from the SecDef. If it's the development of the national military strategy, it's the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff. What is the function of the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff? Check on learning from the previous pages. What does the chairman do? Go ahead, Ms. Powell.
Helps the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff advises the SecDef.
And who else?
The combatant commanders.
Okay, and?
That's
all right, page 19, okay. It's right there. Under National Military Strategy at the top, if you read through that paragraph, it also says that the chairman, so don't forget who's your higher command. Who's your higher command, the highest command that we deal with? The National Security Council. They're all civilians, civilian president, civilian SecDef. Then you have the national, those are all civilians also, right? The ones in charge of Treasury and all of it. And so anything military related, the function of the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff is to advise the Secretary of Defense. The chairman can also advise those combatant commanders. The chairman advises the president and the National Security Council. Let's say the whole council wants to meet and talk about it. The chairman will come in and brief them. So it's not just briefing and advising the SecDef. I wanted to make that clear. You also have additional documents. So all of these documents are used to develop the National Defense Strategy. Strategy for Homeland Defense and Civil Support is prepared by the Secretary of Defense to talk about threats directly to the United States and also to support civil authorities. So think holistically. All right. So before we move on to P, any question? Higher command is the National Security Council, which is made up of the President, Vice President, Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, Secretary of Treasury. Did I miss one? I try to learn them from memory. You always want to pause before you move to a new section, pause and recap the information you just read. Make sure you understand it. So what document do we get from the National Security Council? you get the National Security Strategy. Then the Department of Defense take this big op order, which is the NSF, and produces what document? What is the document that the Department of Defense produces to meet the National Security Strategy? And that is the National Defense Strategy. Are you all grasping? This is the live session is your opportunity to ask questions, or if I'm not explaining it, because when you go back and watch the video later, the video won't be able to answer you. Any question on what I just went back over? All right, so what we're getting ready to talk about now is the PEB overview, PPBE, Plan, Program, Budget, and Execution. So the way in which the Department of Defense determines what the priorities are, the resources available, and how we get those resources is they use the PPBE process to do so. And we're going to go more in depth into each phase in a little while also. So the bottom of page 20, 120 says the ultimate objective of the PPBE is to provide the entire Defense Department with the best mix of forces, equipment, manpower. That's all the resources that we can give to those combatant commanders within a fiscal constraint. Let's not forget about Congress, right? Congress over here dangling the power of the purse, the money. We can come up with all this strategy, but we can't do anything without money. So don't forget about Congress in the back of your mind. But we use a systematic process to prioritize things, to then ask for resources from Congress. So we're going to go over the functions of some additional roles under the PPBE. So let's recap some of it. On page 22 is actually repeating some of the things we already talked about. It's talking about the Secretary and Deputy Secretary of Defense. We already talked about that. The Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the Joint Chiefs have a chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, and we have combatant commanders that are in charge of various portions of the globe. And we say that operational chain of command for resources runs from the president, SecDef, to those combatant commanders, and the communication of the military and advice comes from the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff. So on page 22, in bold, it talks about defense planning guidance, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit. Integrated priority list. That is the only document that we're going to get from the combatant commanders. So anytime you see IPL, it should trigger combatant commanders. And then these IPLs are submitted to the SecDef, Deputy SecDef, Chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, and the military department responsible for that program. That'll come up again later on, so I'm not gonna dive into it. If you notice on the bottom of page 22, it throws back in the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff again. So remember that other role, he's the chairman of the JROC. And that is just repeat information. So you should remember that. Heads of the department, Army, Navy, Air Force, are also notified of requirements. All right, so I think we touched on the USD Comptroller on page 23. So a lot of this I'm just kind of going through because we already covered it. The key thing here for the USD Comptroller, if it deals with the budget, because there's the CFO, if you know their job is Chief Financial Officer, if it deals with anything budget related, the USD Comptroller is the budget advisor to the Secretary of Defense. You see a bunch of bullets under page 23, but the key thing here when it comes to the budget and the execution of that budget, the responsibility falls under the USD comptroller. This will also come up again shortly. But you got to tie the information together, as I stated when we first started, and I'm going to repeat it and repeat it till you get it. Because I do have people who just kind of channel on what's on that page and they forget what they already studied. You already know the information. All right, page 24 tells us at the first bullet, the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy is in charge of the planning phase of peace. So if you are asked on an exam, who is responsible for the planning at the DOD level, it's the USD for policy. There's some other bullets there, but a lot of it is you can read through and learn it. But the key one that I focus on is the first one, conduct and coordinate the planning phase of P. Then you also have the Undersecretary of Defense Acquisition and Sustainment. So that's the USD ANS. If you have an older study guide, it probably says USD ATNL, Acquisition Technology and Logistics, but for the new book, it's USD Acquisition and Sustainment. Advises the SecDef, anything dealing with buying things, big items, the USD ANS is the one in charge of it at the DOD level. Another key individual on page 26 is the Undersecretary of Defense Research and Engineering. This individual used to be the CIO, the Chief Information Officer, or as it says, serves as the Chief Technology Officer for the Department of Defense. So in charge of technology, information, USD, research and engineering. Those are the key things I'm pulling out of here. So technology. I'm just writing in my book. Page 27, the DCAPE. This is the guy that we talked about earlier, in charge of anything cost analysis related. But also under the first bullet, it says the DCAPE is responsible for following relative to the PPBE process. Prepare and publish the DOD's fiscal guidance, because fiscal, we're talking about money. So DOD programming guidance. So in charge of the programming phase of PEEB, we receive guidance from the DCAPE. So the programming guidance is what I'm pointing out. And when we talk about the POM and the programming phase of PEEB, it'll come up again. And then at the bottom of page 27, it talks about the Defense Acquisition Board, the DAB. The DAB is chaired by the Undersecretary of Defense Acquisition and Sustainment. So for me, if you notice, we talk about acquisition and sustainment on page 25. So you may want to write yourself a note, because it's kind of out of place, that the USD ANS is the chairman of the Defense Acquisition Board. Does everyone see what I'm talking about? So I'm going back to page 25, and I'm saying is under this USD ANS is chairman of the DAB, Defense Acquisition Board. Because it's kind of out of place in my mind. Any question on what I just stated? All right, finally, we're on page 28. If I was writing the CDFM guides, this diagram will be in the beginning of each of the modules. So as we know, whatever our mission is, we will never have all the resources we want to do it. So we have to have a system in place in how we determine and prioritize our requirements. And so if you look on page 28, I'm going to focus on the diagram. And I'm going to start on the bottom left. So the bottom left, it says Joint Capabilities Integration and Development System, the JCIDS. The oversight of that is the vice chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, that's the VCJCS, / JROC oversight. Going to talk about the Joint Requirements Oversight Council. Once the big op order, what's the name of the big op order? Our higher command is the National Security Council. Go ahead, Ms. Powell.
No.
What is?
Oh yeah.
Go ahead. What is
That's
the big
what I
op
was going to say. The NSS, the National Security. I'm sorry. The NSS is the op order.
Okay. So the NSS, National Security. So what happens before the defense can do that national defense strategy is they take, if you look at this diagram, you see that NDS in the middle, right? Y'all still with me, right? You see that? So we have our strategy. We know what we want to do, but we need to figure out how to resources. So the Department of Defense uses 3 systems, and those systems overlap, and we're going to go through each one. Those systems overlap so that they can get the resources they need to meet the national defense strategy. So once they have the national defense strategy, because we know the defense strategy is meeting that national security strategy, whatever it says we're supposed to do. The bottom left is what happens is the vice chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, and he has the JROC, Joint Requirements Oversight Council. What they do is they start determining what capabilities do we have. Good. So, yep, we can meet that strategy. But we know there are going to be some things we don't have. So the purpose of the JCIDS, if you read it through there, is that systematic analysis to determine what are our capability gaps. What are we missing in our inventory to meet? Do we need to just get additional resources? So what they look at, have you all heard the term .MLPF? If you work with TRADOC, you've probably heard it. While these joint staff is analyzing the op order, analyzing their capabilities, they're looking at doctrine, organization, training, material, which is equipment, leader development. What do we need to change? What do we need in addition? Do we just need more funding for more people, personnel, facilities? Do we need new buildings? What do we need? So JCIDS, I tell people to learn the systems, JCIDS, PPBE, and the Defense Acquisition System. So as they go through that .MLPF, doctrine, I'm giving it to you. It's on another page, I think in competency 2, but if you want to write them down, in the JCIDS process, the joint staff is reviewing doctrine, organization, training, material, leader development / education, personnel, and facilities. What they're analyzing is they're looking at what the National Defense Strategy says they're supposed to do, and they're determining what are our capability gaps. Capability gaps determination is the purpose of the JCID system. If the result of to fill that capability gap is anything other than material, we don't need an equipment, then it triggers the PPBE system, plan, program, budget, execution. And we have to determine when we get the funding. We need to request the funding from Congress. And so the top system is PPBE. If you look, it tells you the Deputy Secretary of Defense has oversight. That means he or she is in charge of the PPBE as an overall process. We just went over who's in charge of planning, programming, budget, and execution, but we're going to do it again in a few pages after this. So if that .MLPF review in JCID says that the capability gap is requires a material solution and equipment, That triggers the third system, the bottom right of those systems on page 2128, which is the defense acquisition system. And that one will be covered in depth in 2.2. And who's in charge of acquisition? The USD Acquisition and Sustainment, USD ANS. Any question thus far? I walk real slow with these first part of it. It's a lot. All right, so what are the three DoD support system? JSIDs, if you learn them in this order, it'll be easier to remember their functions. JSIDs, PPBE, and the Defense Acquisition System. What is the purpose of JSIDs? Once we know what the defense strategy is, what we're supposed to be able to do to meet the national security strategy, then we need to determine our capability gap. So the analytical process that's going on with the Joint Requirements Oversight Council, telling the story, and who's in charge of the JROC? The Vice Chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff. And that Vice Chairman is making sure that we're staying on point to meet that national defense strategy. So they're looking at doctrine, organization, training, material, leader development, education, personnel, facilities. In each one of those areas, we're going to determine where does the capability gap lie for us to meet the national defense strategy and then meet that national security strategy, the big operation order. JSIDS identifies capability gaps. PPBE helps us to get the resources, and the defense acquisition system helps us to buy what we need, to build research and development, to get those items that we may have to build, we may have to develop because we don't have it in the inventory already. So any question again on the three DoD support systems? So also on that diagram on 28, if you remember, I said the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff is also a co-chairman on the Defense Acquisition Board. What that means with this diagram, the Vice Chairman sits on the left side when they're coming up with the capability gaps, presenting solutions to fix the gap. On the right side, the Vice Chairman, even though it's not listed there, you're going to see it later on, the Vice Chairman also sits under the Defense Acquisition System on their board so that he makes sure things are actually meeting that national defense strategy. Does everyone see that or understand that? Have any questions? Okay, page 29, that diagram has a list. It kind of goes through the PPBE process. Let me just kind of orient you. So to the top left of that planning, program, budgeting, interrelationship, and generic timeline. You need to know how to read it because if you are asked, okay, in January when the defense planning guidance is published, what else is going on? You need to be able to, okay, I just follow what's going on below it at the military department, what's happening. POTUS, that's your president on the top left. We said that the president is the president of the National Security Council, that's the NSC. We already talked about what comes out of the NSC is the National Security Strategy. Then the Department of Defense takes that big op order, the NSS, and at the DoD level, it comes up with the National Defense Strategy. And in order to come up with the National Defense Strategy, we then have to develop the military strategy, and other defense-related strategy, or joint programming policies to develop the defense planning guidance, the DPG. All right, so before I DPG you into it, we're going to go through the pages to understand this. But I wanted to orient you because you can always go back to the diagram once we go through the pages. On the bottom left of that diagram, you see the IPL, Integrated Priority List. As we talk about it, kind of picture where it lies. Combatant commanders has priority for resources, so they need to let the SecDef, they need to let the Joint Chief of Staff know what their requirements are. That is published in an IPL. All right, so let's go to the pages, makes it a little bit easier to understand. So now we're going to go through the PPBE process. Let me see if they talk about JSID. Again, if I was writing the book, I would talk about JSIDs first and then PPBE, but it's not in there, so let's stick with what we have. All right, so I'm going to page 31, 2131. Trying to see where's the good stopping point. Yeah, once we get through all the moving pieces and the people and the documents, then I'll stop there for today. All right, so planning phase of P, page 31. Who did we say was in charge of the planning phase of P? We said it was the USD for policy. So let's get that off. It's not on this page because we learned it previously. The final document of the planning phase of P is the Defense Planning Guidance. So before we execute any action, we have to receive guidance from higher. So from the DoD level, the final document that we get out of the planning phase, even if you don't remember what's going on in planning, is make sure you know that the last document that's published is the planning guidance, the DPG. Do not just learn acronyms. Make sure you know exactly what the acronyms mean. Because when you're on an exam and you're already flustered and have that anxiety, and they may ask a simple question as what does this acronym stand for, and everything is going to start looking like it's right. I promise you. It's like, well, defense programming guidance. Yeah, that sounds good, but no, the only DPG you're going to learn is defense planning guidance. All right, let's see. That's all I have for that one. So we take the national security strategy, come up with the national defense strategy. Once we come up with what it's going to take to fill it, then we come up with the defense planning guidance. If we know we're going into the PPBE process, then we need planning guidance before we start planning. So on page 32, it repeats again, the process of planning. It tells you that several documents are used in the planning. The National Defense Strategy, which is built out of the National Security Strategy. The National Military Strategy. Who develops and writes the National Military Strategy? Who develops and writes the National Military Strategy?
The Joint Chiefs of Staff.
Make sure you say the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff.
The chairman of the Joint Chief of
Because
Staff.
now, yeah, the chairman represents the whole Joint Staff. But the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff develops the National Military Strategy. Then the SecDef comes with the Joint Planning Document. If you go back to that diagram, you'll see the JPD. The military department's long-range plans, that's also the chairman. So anything dealing with directly with the military, the one that's doing the work and the legwork is the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff and the rest of the joint staff under him. So let's see what's under the focus of planning. Defining the national military strategy. Okay, so I'm not going to read these. These are pretty straightforward. Like, why are you going to plan? Because I got to make sure I can execute what it is that we said we're going to do. And then if we have different joint staff, different military departments, joint strategic planning means I need to also determine how I'm going to integrate all the resources, my Air Force, my Navy, my Army assets. So you have the joint strategic planning. On page 2133, the second to last paragraph, the primary interaction between the combatant commanders and military department is through the various component commanders. You got an exception in there. Combatant commands, with the exception of Special Operations Command, do not submit their own POM. That's like, okay, where does this information come from? It's like outside of what we're talking about, but make sure you don't miss it. So combatant commanders don't submit POMs. What they do is they submit an integrated priority list to several entities to include the military department that does the POM. So when you're working on a POM, and if you have a combatant command out there that determines they need resources from the Army, then the Army has to include the requirements of the combatant commanders in their POM. And whenever you hear integrated priority list, combatant commanders produces that to tell the higher commands what they need in their region. All right. So on page 34, it goes into a little bit more detail with the integrated priority list, and it says the IPLs are submitted to the Secretary of Defense, the Chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, and to the military department that's responsible for that function. Is it an Army asset we need? Well, we need to let the Army know. Is it a Navy asset? And so forth, or Marine, which falls under the Navy. So again, what is the final planning document? That is the Defense Planning Guidance. All I'm doing is repeating. Why? Because on page 35, I'm moving to the second phase of the PPBE, Plan, Program, Budget, Execution. As I stated earlier, who's in charge of the programming phase of P? Who do we get programming guidance from? And you may want to write it on that page if you don't already have it. That is the DK. Let's see. I'm trying to see if they ever mention them. It's mentioned later as an acronym. I don't think I see it on this page. Director of Cost Assessment and Program Evaluation. Okay, there it is. It's on the top of page 36. So whenever you get to a function, you need to know who at a DoD level is responsible for that function. Programming, compiling and submitting POM estimates. In the spring of each year, the Director of CAPE, Cost Assessment and Program Evaluation is what CAPE stands for, and the USD Comptroller. Because during the POM phase, you receive POM guidance and you also receive budget guidance, right? And development of the budget for that fiscal year. And so the guidance comes from the DK for programming, and for the budget, the guidance comes from the comptroller. That is what it's saying in this paragraph on the top of page 36. So POM stands for Program Objective Memorandum. As I stated, we might do POM on a regular, but some people don't know what POM stands for. Program Objective Memorandum. So if you see it, you want to know what it stands for. Those are the proposed programs, because now we know what we need in the PPBE process. We determine that the capabilities that we need are money. We need additional funding. We need additional equipment. We need additional personnel. So we use the PPBE process. When the JSIDs went through that MLPF, they go through all of those, doctrine, organization, training, etc., and they determined it was not a material solution that we needed, then it triggered this process, the PPBE system. On page 37. So we say, actually, let's go on the bottom of page 36 before I hit 37. So we say that the DCAPE, Director of Cost Assessment and Program Evaluation, is in charge of the programming phase of P. As a part of that process, that last paragraph at the bottom of 36, upon receipt of the components POM, the OSD DCAPE, that's the same guy, also updates, and they just put an acronym, FYDP. That's going to become important shortly. So on page 37, now they're talking about the FYDP. What is that? You also going to need to know what it is. So as we're going through the programming phase, the DCAPE updates the future year's defense program. The definition tells you on the slide and also on the paragraph, it is an automated database that summarizes, and I like diagrams, so I'm going to show you the diagram in a minute. It summarizes all the requirements that we need to accomplish that mission. So let's skip 37. I'm going to come back to 37. Let's go to 38. I'm a visual, so hopefully if you are, this diagram will help you. So every mission that the Department of Defense has falls under 1 through 12 of these major force programs. When we say POM, these are the programs. So strategic forces, general purpose, mobility, special operations, national security. So every function Department of Defense does falls under 1 through 12 different major force programs. All the resources, all the appropriations can be used for any one of those programs by the different components. So that's what the diagram is telling you. In case you can't remember, Future Year Defense Program, think of their, I say Rubik's Cube. For those who are familiar with the cube, is 12 major force programs that are used to execute the Department of Defense mission used by various components, and we need additional or different types of DoD appropriations to do it. FYDP is a database that the DCAPE updates as they're going through the POM process. Back to page 37, it says what's in the Future Year Defense Program. I do get a lot of people that come back and say, yeah, they were like, okay, is it 10 years? Is it 7 years? Is it 3 years? So make sure you study this part. So what it does, it tells you the total obligation of obligational authority. How much does it cost to do this mission? So you need to know the total cost. So in the Future Year Defense Program, it looks at the manpower, forces needed, equipment, manpower, and total obligational authority identified to a program element into that major defense program, one of those 12. 10 years of data identified as prior year, current year, that is the current when Congress is enacting that budget, a budget year, the next 4 years for resources, and the following 3 years. So that is 10 years of data that is covered in the Future Year Defense Program. Any question on the FYDP or Future Year Defense Program, FYDP? On the bottom of page 37, some additional information. If you've gone through module 1, you would have covered the presidential budget requirements. After the president submits the budget to Congress, no later than the first Monday in February for the fiscal year, and the department has finalized the Future Years Defense Program database, also provided to Congress later in the spring, the database becomes the start point or baseline for the components POM submission. So whatever that final is, that becomes the starting point for your next. So the Future Year Defense Program is used by the military departments to help build their POM and BEST, Budget Estimate Submission. That's what BEST stands for. So the PRESBUD. And if you also went through Module 1, you will learn the law that said the president had to submit the budget to Congress no later than the first Monday in February was the 1921 Budget and Accounting Act. That's not on the page. It's based off of knowledge from Module 1 and 3. All right, so page 39, kind of go over some other OSD level forums. Just understanding when you submit the POM, when you submit the budget, it goes through several levels of review. So 3-star deputy management group, Secretary of Defense then makes a decision. That's all it's saying here. Programmatic issues, program review. Once they review the POM, if there are issues that has to be addressed before it gets to the Secretary of Defense to sign off on. On page 41 talks about chairman's program assessment. That chairman is the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff. So as you submit your POM, as the budget estimate submission goes up, the chairman is intricately involved in that process, and the chairman provides his recommendation. So that's the program assessment and recommendation. So the final documents, let me put final document in the programming phase of PEEB at the DoD level is called the Program Decision Memorandum. Just like the final document at the planning was the Defense Planning Guidance, the final document at the programming phase is the Program Decision Memorandum, because that triggers the end of the programming phase of PEEB. And it says this on the bottom of page 41, if you want to check it. So final document at the end of the POM or programming is the PDM. And then finally, the budget phase. Who did we say is in charge of the budget phase of PEEB? That is your USD comptroller. So their job is now to take the programs, those programs that we said we want, that programming information, and translate it in budget resources, appropriation requests for us to be able to get the resources we need. So they translate. If you look on page 42, the final phase of the preparation of the president's budget is the budget development. It translates the programs into appropriation format. We know what our plan was in the beginning to meet that national defense strategy. And then we developed the programs that we need to accomplish that plan. And then we need the budget to translate into appropriation format so that we can request the money from Congress. On page 43, so when you're working the budget, it's called the Budget Estimate Submission, the BEST. So the acronym was mentioned earlier. Now you can see it in print. So each component submits a BEST to OSD no later than the due date specified from the guidance. So before anything starts, they always receive guidance, and then the guidance will tell them the suspense date. Page 44. So the reason, again, I recommend Module 1 and 3, because you would have learned about Congress, the GAO, Government Accountability Office. You will learn about Congressional Budget Office. At the executive branch, you would have learned about OMB, Office of Management and Budget. So on page 44, when it says OSD/OMB budget review, Once the OSD budget goes up to OMB, because that's their higher, and then they do a scrub of that budget. It's called the fall review, in bold on page 44. So the fall review is for them to go over. So let's say they're going over FY25. This fall, they'll be going over FY26. They'll sit down, and does it give you the timeline? I don't think it does on this page, but they go through the fall review. So I'm thinking September, October timeframe. At the end of the fall review, the document that is produced is the program budget decision. So at the OSD level, just like at the programming phase, you had the program decision memorandum. At the budget phase, once OSD sits down with Office of Management and Budget and go over the budget, then that particular budget request that gets sent up and added to the press bud is the program budget decision. That's the final budget numbers that the OSD is sending up. Likewise, as in the programming phase, the DCAPE was updating the future year defense program. On the budget side on page 45, the comptrollers are updating the comptroller information system with the updated numbers for the budget. And then issue resolution is exactly what it says. If there are any discrepancies, issues, I'm sure when they sit down with OMB, OMB is going to say yay or nay, take this out, put this in. And not listed directly here, but I'm still going to tell you, just like OSD has the final document, budget document called the program budget decision, when you do it on the OMB side, once a decision is made, it's called the OMB passback. And that was in module, was it 1, if I'm not mistaken. I think it's in 1 and 3. You will learn that. So the final budget numbers for OSD is program budget decision, and the final budget document at the Office of Management and Budget is the OMB passback. That means that's what they're submitting to the president for inclusion in the press bud. All right, so we're almost there. Page 46 is the relationship between acquisition. So remember, 3 DoD system, JSIDS, PPBE, Defense Acquisition System. What triggers the acquisition system? That means your capability gap, .mlpf, when we look and we start checking what's going to fill that gap, it says a material solution is going to fill that gap, and equipment. So it triggers the acquisition side of the house. So products of long-range planning guides both the PPBE and the acquisition. So research, development, and acquisition plan is a continuous. All right, y'all can read for yourself. What I want to get down to is the Defense Acquisition Board. Remember, again, the vice chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, and it finally, I think it finally mentions it here. And see if they even mention it. Yep. So finally, you can see it in print on page 46, that last paragraph. So the USD ANS Acquisition and Sustainment is in charge of this defense. Everybody have a council or a board that helps them to do their job. At the acquisition side, they have the Defense Acquisition Board, but the vice chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff co-chairs the defense side also. So that's what you're reading. And he's in charge of the Joint Requirements Oversight Council. All of this is repetitive. So it's repeated. JROC on page 47. This group is made up of all the joint staff personnel they represent the warfighter. So when they're looking at the capabilities that .mlpf in the JSID system, they're operating as if they're the Army. They're operating as, okay, These are the Army resources, Air Force resources that we need. This is what we're missing. We need, if we're going into Iraq, we need up-armored Humvee that we don't currently have in our inventory. We need the acquisition system to be triggered and so forth. On page 47, under the JROC. So understand that when the JSITS process completes, that Joint Requirements Oversight Council has to have a solution. They can't just say, okay, that's our capability gap. We're missing an up-armored Humvee. Well, they have to be detailed in what that requirement is going to be to fill that capability gap. So the document that the JROC produces at the end of the JSITS process is the initial capabilities document, the ICD. Any question? I'm trying to work with the book and trying to help you to see the process. So every process ends with a document. They don't just do it and be like, okay, we're done. They have to put it in a document. So think of it that way. So the JSITS ends with the ICD, is what JROC recommends to fill that acquisition capability gap. All right, page 48 has different P terms. So we talk about integrated priority list. Combatant commanders do that. Defense planning guidance. So it tells you the SecDef provides planning guidance. POM in the programming phase. Who's in charge of POM? That's the USD for policy. For the POM is programming. So that's the DK. See, I have to catch myself. Issue books is simply once you submit your POMs and they have questions, issues, they kind of simplify it in a few documents, one-page narratives to explain the answer to that issue. Program decision memorandum with an A, okay, is the final document at the programming phase. Resource management decision. Let me point this out to you. In the older study guides, the final document at the programming and the budgeting phase used to be called resource management decision. So the fact that they put it in this book tells me that you may see RMD or you may see program decision memorandum or program budget decision. So bear that in mind. If you happen to see RMD, which was not mentioned in any part of this book, but they put it here, so that means you may see it. It says these were legacy documents between 2010 and 2015. These used to be the final document at the programming and the budgeting phase. All right. We say the future years defense programs updated by the DCAPE, and the Comptroller Information System is updated by the USD Comptroller. All the budget is then incorporated into the president's budget. And correction on page 49, it was the 1974 update to that law that I talked about, Congressional Budget Act, that requires the president to submit the annual budget to Congress no later than the first Monday in February. So I think I said the 1921 budget. So it's the 1974 Congressional Budget Act that required the president to submit the budget no later than first Monday in February. All right, so this is going to be my stopping point for today before and we'll pick up with execution next week as we go into the appropriations, what happens at Congress once you submit the budget request. We'll go from there. It's the same process as you did in module 1 and module 3 if you already took those. All right, so this was a lot of information today. So I recommend that you go over the information several times. Do not take the pages independent because they're repeating a lot of the information that you've learned on previous pages. So make sure you understand the processes, the documents at the end of each phase, who is responsible for that phase at that level. If you start with the highest level of command, which is the National Security Council, work your way back down to Department of Defense, then those subordinate staff and sections that work under the Department of Defense and what they're responsible for, it'll be easier for you to manage the information. Any final questions before I close out the study group for today? All right, I don't hear any questions. All right, this is Helen Thomas and the CDFM study group. So if you have not already subscribed to our YouTube page, please go ahead and do so when you review this video. If you like it, you see I said something incorrectly, you can put it on there. Just be courteous how you do it so I don't have to delete your comment. Again, don't be rude. If I'm a one man or one woman show, trying to keep the information as updated as possible. So I know I'm going to make some mistakes. So if you see something, you want to email me, hey, take a look at this. Please, I welcome you guys inside. So if nothing else brings my attention, this is Helen Thomas and the CDFM study group. I'll see you guys again next time. Thank you. Recording stopped.